This is chapter 13 of The First Stone. Your turn, Reef, said Frank Coville. Everyone in the family room looked at Reef, waiting for him to speak. Reef hated this part more than anything else, but he knew by now that they'd go on waiting until he spoke. One of the Coville's rules, honor your commitments. And at the North Hills, one of your commitments was spilling your guts in the family room every night at 6. Issue Exploration was Coville's name for it. But what it amounted to was a whine and whimper session when everybody got to about something that was bothering him, and everyone else got to suggest, what did Coville call it, strategies for resolving the problem, or some such bull, and somehow the process was supposed to empower them, another of Coville's phrases, right? It wasn't that Reef didn't have things to complain about. Hell, if he'd wanted to, he'd have ranted nonstop about what life last 2 weeks had been like. He'd have said how listening to a bunch of losers moan over how misunderstood they were was enough to make him puke, how their infighting and backstabbing were worse than any group of girls had ever seen, how those goddamn weekly duties Coville assigned them were a pain in the ass, and he'd give anything not to wash another dish, clean another shower, or vacuum another rug, unless, of course, it was his own dish, shower, and rug that he didn't have to share with these heads. At the top of his list, though, would be the greenhouse out back. The thing hadn't been used in years, yet for some reason it was Reef's job to repair it. Like the world, food production would rise 10% once he'd managed to replace all those broken panels. He only had to look at the bandages on his fingers to remind himself that what issue number 1 was for Reef Kennedy. But of course, he didn't say any of those things. Frank Coville was a few bricks short of a load if he thought Reef was going to take part in all that touchy-feely family room sharing. So Reef fell back on his old standby, the lack of toilet paper in the third-room bathroom. Although he'd already used that one a few times, he didn't have the energy or the inclination to make up something else. And besides, since Alex was still the only other resident on the third floor, Reef was pretty sure he could count on the fairy to take offense and launch into his wounded drama queen routine, which was always good for a laugh. That is, if you could forget about rule number 2. In the last 2 weeks, though, Reef had learned how to laugh on the inside without letting anyone know he was busting a cut at their expense. The room was oddly quiet, and he looked up to see everyone staring at him. Even Alex was silent. Apparently now, in previous to the toilet paper attack, one of Coville's eyebrows was raised, an expression everyone, including Reef, now recognized as one of the impatience. Something else? Reef asked. Coville made a tent with his fingers, and he studied them for a moment. Then, turning his gaze on Reef, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Why are you wasting everyone's time, Reef?" Reef returned his stare without blinking. "I wasn't the one who came up with this family room He paused for just a second, remembering how this profanity had earned him more than a few extra jobs since day 1. He continued carefully, "Stuff? If you don't want to hear what's bothering me, don't ask the question." Coville's expression did not change. He brought his hands up and pressed his index finger to his lips, then lowered his hand and folded them in his lap. "I do want to hear what's bothering you, Reef. We all do. That's why I'm asking the question. And I told you," Coville cut him off, "don't you ever get tired of playing the part?" Reef blinked. "What part?" "The I don't need anybody tough guy routine. Doesn't it get old after a while?" It was Reef's turn to look at his fingers. He tried not to make fists. For one thing, his fingers hurt. He wasn't used to working with a hammer and its metal head and found his fingers nearly as often as the nails they'd held. But he also didn't want to give Coville the satisfaction of knowing he'd hit home. "I don't need a routine," he said. Coville leaned forward. "That's where you're wrong, Reef. We all need routines. Most humans being can't handle a life that's always in flux. We'd go crazy if there weren't constants we could depend on. We instinctively look for patterns, and when we don't find them, we create our own. It's our innate need for security, for normalcy. But you don't think I'm normal? Is that it? Reef fought the urge to stand up, cross the room, and ram his bandage covered knuckles into Coville's face. On the contrary, Reef, I think you're very normal. It's just that you've become so good at sustaining the patterns you've created that you can't see a way outside them. Reef swallowed, the sound in his throat, like air bubbling up though ketchup. 2 minutes outside with you alone, you son of a. With no court ruling, no group home regulations, no additional duties, nothing. Just you and me. Then we'd see what patterns I could create. All right, on your face. Reef wasn't suddenly conscious of 5 other pairs of eyes on him, their owners waiting for his response with open-mouthed interest. Do me a favor, Coville said. Reef blinked again. Favor? Be honest with me, with us, with yourself. Say one thing you'd like to see happen here that'd make a difference to you. Reef let the moments pile up on each other, let the silence occupy space in that room. Then I'd like to see the toilet paper in the third room bathroom. Geez, man, you sure get off on yanking Frank's chain. Owen pointed the remote at the television, flicking back and forth between a sitcom and a movie in which Emma Thompson played some bald professor dying of cancer. He flicked so rapidly that at times it seemed as though the laugh track were part of the movie, the chuckles and guffaws, an ironic counterpoint to the cancer victim's tragic life. When Reef didn't reply, Owen pressed the mute button and turned to face him. I really thought he was going to lose it. Reef dragged his eyes from the television screen to Owen. You think so? Didn't you? Reef grinned. Yeah, there was a moment when he thought Coville might actually let his guard down, showed him he was human, and not just some psychology spouting ex-con with a degree in sanctimonious bull. But it hadn't happened. Not yet. Anyways, maybe soon though. If Reef kept the pressure on, and he was good at it after all, he had plenty of time. He certainly wasn't going anywhere. In that, however, he was wrong. Reef, got a minute? Reef turned to Coville in the doorway. What's up? I need to see you in my office. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the front of the house, his solid bulk making the oak floorboards groan. Doesn't sound good? Owen said. Reef shrugged. What could Coville do to him? He'd done his work, technically, followed every one of his goddamn regulations, hadn't earned an extra job in 2 days, hadn't had any contact with his friends, hadn't even left the house except to pick up groceries when he was on kitchen detail, building materials for the greenhouse and some personal stuff. Coville himself had driven him there and back in his pickup. There were days, of course, where he'd have given his right arm for a snort or a joint or even a lousy Bud Light, but he'd played the game, kept his nose clean. What could Coville possibly do to him? Sit down, Coville said when Reef entered his office. Reef slumped into the same chair he'd sat in his first day at North Hills. Nothing in the office had changed. Same neat rows of binders, same neat piles of papers. Jesus, Coville, Reef thought, and you accuse me of clinging to patterns? Your textbook, man? Coville closed the door, but didn't go around behind his desk. Instead, he pulled up a chair beside Reef and sat down. In his hands was a folder. You've got 2 weeks under your belt. Reef, how would you say things are going? Reef thought about the question, wondered if this was going to be one of those empowering self-assessment sessions he'd heard Alex describe. He'd hoped it wouldn't take too long. He wanted to see if the bald chick croaked. Okay, I guess, he replied. Coville's face didn't betray his thoughts. You towed the line, all right, although you're still giving me lip service. I'd hoped I would have eased up a little bit by now. Reef thought suddenly about an old Sandra Bullock movie that Alex had watched a few nights ago. Alex was big on Bullock, wanted to be Bullock. In fact, the movie was stupid and Reef had left the family room 10 minutes after it started. He might have guessed it'd be a turkey with a name like Hope Floats. He thought about the title now. Apparently Coville still thought hope was a good thing. He had learned that hope sinks like a stone. When Reef offered no comment, Colville opened up the file he was holding now. Now that you've settled in, it's time to start complying with the other conditions of Judge Thomas's rulings. Reef gave no reaction, just waited. I've registered you for school, which is still a few weeks away. He flipped through some papers in the folder. Now it's time to get you involved in the rehab volunteer program the judge mentioned. You've got quite a few options if you'd care to hear. Just pick one. What goddamn difference did it make anyway? Colville looked at him, let the seconds tick by the way Reef had done earlier in the family room. Then let's go with the first one on the list. He looked down at the file. There's a contact person listed here. I'll call tonight. They're busy people. I'll try to set up a meeting for someone next week. He closed the folder and glanced up. You know, it's a good time to be getting involved in this. Volunteers can be scary during the summer with people away on vacation, and besides, you'll soon be finished with the repairs to the greenhouse. You've done some good work here. Reef thought of the days he'd spent crawling over the crystally structure in the backyard, thought of the cuts he'd got on his hands and arms from the sharp edges of glass panels he'd replaced. He cracked two in the process, but surprisingly Colville had made him pay for those. There's a difference between an accident and an intentional act, he had said. Reef wasn't so sure about that when the result was pretty much the same, but he'd been glad nonetheless that Colville was only going to deduct from his monthly social services, check the cost of the panel he had broken his first day. Is that all? He asked, standing up. One more thing, Colville said. Yeah, you had another call today from that girl. Scar, Reef said. It was a statement, not a question. Yes, this is probably none of my business, but are you ever going to call her back? You do have phone privileges, you know. You're right, Reef said. It's none of your business. Reef tilted his head back and drained the can of Coke he'd taken from the fridge. When he'd returned to the family room, Owen had been joined by Keith and Gordy, and the three of them were glued to some monster truck rally on the Extreme Sports Channel. In the past, Reef would have enjoyed watching the mindless destruction such as an event offered. But that was before. Before what, though? Before coming to North Hills? Or before sitting, though, the hearing and seeing the pictures of the car that girl had been driving? He wasn't sure, or maybe he was sure and didn't want to admit it. Christ! Colville's mind games were up his head. Now he wasn't sure of anything. He left the family room and headed through the kitchen, grabbing a Coke on his way out to the backyard. He set the empty can down and leaned against the railing, staring at the outline of the greenhouse in the fading summer light. You've done some good work there. Good or not, it certainly hadn't been easy. The initial cleanup had been since no one had ever bothered to clean out the broken glass. Colville said he hadn't had time to get around it with all the work he'd been doing on the main house, but Reef suspected he'd just been waiting for free inmate labor. When Reef had asked why some of the others couldn't help out, Colville had just said everybody had jobs to do, and this one was Reef's. Eat and die, Reef had wanted to tell him, but as it turned out, having someone else working with him would have been too awkward, maybe even dangerous. It wasn't a big structure to begin with, and having another body moving around inside would have been complicated things. And truth to be told, Reef preferred working alone. That way only he saw the mistakes he made. It was an old greenhouse made of wood rather than vinyl-covered metal like the muck-up he'd seen at the Kent Building Supplies. That one would have been a lot easier to work on, since all you'd have to do was take the screws out of the brackets that held the panels in place, replace the glass and screw the brackets back on. His greenhouse had he surprised himself lately by thinking of it as his required a lot more work than that. The panels were held in place by strips of cedar that had been priced away from the glass. No easy feat, since the glass offered no leverage to pry up the nails. The first two tries, he'd crackled perfectly good panels, then he'd pulled the hammer back. It hurt bearing down directly on the glass, but he'd figure out to use pieces of wood so the pressure of the hammerhead was evenly distributed over the frame. Removing the broken panels was hard enough. Installing the new glass was a... Although the guy at Kent had cut the glass to the measurements Reef had written down, Reef had to cut new cedar brackets himself, and getting them the right length wasn't easy. If he cut them too long, then there would be no room for the wood to expand in damp weather. If he cut them too short, water would seep in under the bracket and over time rot the wood again. Colville had told him that a couple of the panels had broken simply because the inside brackets had rotted out and the glass had fallen clean though. The most crucial part of the process was the glazing, applying a thin line of caulking between the wood and the glass to keep everything watertight. Too much and you made a mess. Too little and you ended up with rot. Nothing, it seemed, was easy. Like this thing with Scar, she'd call him 4 or 5 times already, but each time he'd refuse to go to the phone, told whoever had answered it to take a message. He wasn't even sure why he didn't want to talk to her. The first time he'd been up on the ladder, removing one of the cracked roof panels, and didn't make sense to crawl all the way down, and when he could just call her back. The next time, though, he'd been watching TV, and the time after that, he'd just been eating supper. But something had kept him from going to the phone. He wasn't quite sure what. For a time, he thought the reason was tied up somehow in the greenhouse, like the bit about glazing. Scar was the wood, and he was the water. There needed to be something between them to keep everything solid and whole. And for the time being anyway, North Hills was that something. Reef looked at the Coke again, picked it up with his right hand and squeezed it. The can collapsed easily into a crude hourglass shape. The words on the side were coordinated and illegible from somewhere in his head, and he heard, "Goddamn cars are no more tin cans," then recalled at the moment, in a sudden rush of memory. The old Dutch Dart sat along the edge of some road. It was Sunday, and his grandmother had wanted to take Reef to the beach he'd never seen before, and he was excited, but they were late setting out because his grandfather had been drinking. Now the Dart was pulled over to the side, its hood up, motor dead, and his grandfather was everlasting kicking out of the front fender, driver's door, back fender, working his way around the trunk, which he'd opened. Taking out the long wrench, he swung it again and again, first smashing out the taillights, then working his way back around the front of the car, knocking off the side mirror and bashing into the driver's side windows. Reef had slid out of the car just as his grandfather began kicking the front fender, and he pleaded with his grandmother, who sat in front seat, to get out too, but she hadn't. She just sat there waiting, staring straight ahead, as if looking down a road different than the one Reef and his grandfather were standing on, a Reef that held possibly rather than punishment, a further rather than endless nights of fear. When her drunken husband was finally too exhausted to swing the long wrench anymore, she climbed out and put her hand on his shoulder, whispered something Reef couldn't hear. Then she moved to the edge of the road and held out her thumb, flagged down a car, and drove them all back to the city. Goddamn cars are no more tin cans. Reef thought again of the picture in the courtroom, tried to twist and pull the a can back into shape, but of course it was ruined. He threw it to the ground, jumped on it, planted it with both feet, bent down and picked up, wound his arm back to fling it as far as he could, but the greenhouse was in the way. He wanted to cry out, but he did not. He lowered his arm, looked at what remained of the can for a long moment, then turned and dropped into the recycling bin beside the deck. Then he went back into the house.